The frozen Delaware River reflected the pale light of dawn on January 2nd, 1777, as General George Washington stood at his field headquarters in Trenton, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the bitter winter air. Just 1 week earlier, his Continental Army had achieved what many deemed impossible: a stunning victory over Hessian forces that had revitalized a dying revolution. Yet victory, Washington knew, was a fleeting mistress, and the British war machine was already grinding toward him with renewed fury. Colonel Alexander Hamilton approached through the snow-covered camp, his young face bearing the weight of urgent intelligence. "General, our scouts report Cornwallis has crossed the Delaware with 8,000 men. They're advancing on Trenton with artillery and cavalry." Washington's weathered hands gripped the pommel of his sword as he absorbed this dire news. The trap was closing around his small force of barely 3,000 Continental soldiers and militia, most of whom had been ready to abandon the cause mere days ago. The victory at Trenton had been a Christmas miracle, but Washington understood that miracles required both divine providence and human cunning to sustain them. His army, swollen with re-enlistments following their unexpected triumph over the Hessians, still faced overwhelming odds. British General Charles Cornwallis, stung by the humiliation of losing an entire garrison to what he had dismissed as a rabble in arms, was now personally leading a formidable force to crush the Continental Army once and for all. As Washington surveyed his encampment along the banks of the Assunpink Creek, he could see the exhaustion etched into every soldier's face. These men had marched through a blizzard on Christmas night, fought a desperate battle in the streets of Trenton, and now faced the prospect of annihilation by one of Britain's most capable generals. The flickering campfires cast dancing shadows across faces that had known too much hardship. Yet something had changed in their eyes, a spark of hope that had been absent for months. The sound of distant drums echoed across the frozen landscape as Cornwallis's advance guard approached. Washington's officers gathered around him, their faces grim with the knowledge that retreat across the Delaware was impossible. The ice floes would doom any attempt to ferry the army to safety. They were trapped between the river and an enemy force that outnumbered them nearly 3-1. Captain Alexander Graydon of the Pennsylvania militia voiced what every man was thinking. "General, we cannot hope to hold this position against such overwhelming numbers." Washington's piercing blue eyes surveyed the terrain with the calculating gaze of a master strategist. The old planner from Virginia had learned that in war, as in life, the impossible often became possible through audacity and timing. His mind was already working, formulating a plan that would either save his army or destroy it completely. The fate of the American Revolution hung in the balance, and Washington knew that the next 24 hours would determine whether liberty would survive or perish. In the snows of New Jersey, the British drums grew louder, and Washington could see the glint of bayonets in the distance. History was about to turn on the decisions made in these crucial moments. Lord Charles Cornwallis rode at the head of his column with the confidence of a man who had seldom tasted defeat. The Earl had left his comfortable winter quarters in New York upon receiving word of the Trenton disaster, determined to personally restore British honor and crush the rebellion that had dared to humiliate His Majesty's forces. His scarlet uniform was immaculate despite the harsh weather. At his experience, I assessed the tactical situation with professional satisfaction. As his forces approached the rebel positions along the Assunpink Creek, the British general had reason for optimism. His force included the crack 17th Light Infantry, the 40th Foot, and seasoned Hessian regiments eager to avenge their fallen comrades. Artillery pieces rolled through the muddy roads, their bronze barrels promising devastating firepower against Washington's ragtag Continentals. Cornwallis had also brought a substantial cavalry contingent, knowing that mounted troops would be decisive if the rebels attempted to flee across the countryside. As afternoon shadows lengthened on January 2nd, 1777, the 1st British reconnaissance units made contact with American outposts. Skirmishing erupted along the Princeton road as Continental riflemen engaged the enemy advance guard, their long rifles cracking in the cold air. Captain Thomas Forrest's battery of artillery, positioned near the stone bridge over Assunpink Creek, opened fire, sending round shot whizzing toward the approaching British columns. Washington had deployed his forces with careful attention to terrain and timing. He positioned his best troops, the Philadelphia Associators and Haslett's Delaware Regiment, along the creek, while placing his artillery to command the approaches to Trenton. The general himself rode among his men, his presence alone worth a regiment, as he encouraged his soldiers with quiet words and steady demeanor. "Hold your ground, "Men," he called out as British musket balls began to whine overhead. "Show them that Americans can fight." The battle along the Sunpink Creek intensified as Cornwallis pressed his assault. Wave after wave of British infantry advanced across the open ground, their disciplined ranks maintaining formation despite the withering fire from the American positions. The red-coated soldiers moved with mechanical precision, their brown-best muskets gleaming in the pale winter sunlight. Yet each assault was repulsed by determined American resistance, the rebels fighting with a desperation born of necessity and newfound confidence. According to historical accounts, preserved in the Pennsylvania Gazette archives, the fighting reached its crescendo as British forces attempted to storm the Stone Bridge. Captain Alexander Hamilton directed the placement of cannons with mathematical precision, while Colonel John Haslett's men poured devastating volleys into the advancing enemy ranks. The narrow bridge became a killing ground, where British valor met American determination in deadly embrace. As darkness fell over the battlefield, Cornwallis made a fateful decision that would echo through history, confident that he had Washington trapped with no avenue of escape. The British general ordered his forces to pull back and make camp. "We'll bag the Fox in the morning," he reportedly told his officers, certain that dawn would bring the destruction of the Continental Army. The Earl's military experience told him that Washington's position was hopeless, trapped between his superior force and an ice-choked Delaware River. But in his headquarters tent that night, Washington was not contemplating surrender. Instead, he was planning one of the most audacious maneuvers in military history, a gambit that would either secure American independence or doom the Revolution to extinction in the frozen fields of New Jersey. The flickering candlelight in Washington's commandeered house cast long shadows across the faces of his most trusted officers as they gathered for what might be their final council of war. The sound of British sentries calling challenges to one another drifted through the winter night, a constant reminder of the enemy forces that surrounded them on three sides. Colonel Joseph Reed, Washington's secretary and confidant, spread a hand-drawn map across the rough wooden table, while the assembled generals studied their desperate situation. "Gentlemen," Washington began, his voice steady despite the gravity of their circumstances. "Lord Cornwallis believes he has us trapped, like foxes in a den. Perhaps it is time to show him that American foxes have more than one way out of their lair." The general's finger traced a route on the map that led northeast from Trenton, skirting around the British left flank toward the village of Princeton. It was a bold stroke that would require splitting his already outnumbered force and marching through enemy territory in the depths of winter. General Nathanael Greene, despite his youth, had proven himself one of Washington's most capable subordinates. The Rhode Islander studied the proposed route with a strategist's eye, noting the dangers and opportunities it presented. "If we can reach Princeton undetected," Greene observed, "we might strike the British garrison there before Cornwallis realizes we've escaped his trap. But the risks are enormous if we're discovered. We'll be caught in the open and destroyed piecemeal." Colonel John Cadwalader, commanding the Pennsylvania militia, raised concerns about the condition of his men. Many were poorly equipped for winter campaigning, and the prospect of a night march followed by battle would test their endurance to the breaking point. Yet there was something in the faces around that table of recognition that audacity might be their only salvation. Captain Thomas Rodney would later write in his journal that Washington's calm confidence infected every man present, transforming despair into desperate hope. The plan that emerged from that midnight conference was breathtaking in its complexity and risk. Washington would leave a skeletal force behind to maintain the campfires and create the illusion that his army remained in position along the Sunpink Creek. Meanwhile, the main body would begin a circuitous march at 1 o'clock in the morning, moving northeast along back roads and farm tracks to approach Princeton from an unexpected direction. If successful, they would destroy the British garrison and capture vital supplies before Cornwallis could react. Dr. Benjamin Rush, serving as both physician and political advisor to the Army, captured the mood of that historic gathering in his later memoirs published in the American Philosophical Society Transactions. According to Rush's account, Washington's demeanor combined the calm of a chess master with the intensity of a man who understood that the fate of an entire nation rested on the decisions made in that candlelit room. The general assigned specific roles to each officer with characteristic attention to detail. General Hugh Mercer would lead the advance guard with his Virginia and Delaware troops, while General John Sullivan commanded the right wing composed primarily of New Hampshire and Massachusetts regiments. Artillery under Captain Alexander Hamilton and Captain Thomas Forrest would provide crucial firepower support, despite the challenges of moving cannons through frozen mud and snow. As the officers prepared to depart and ready their commands, Washington pulled aside his young aide-de-camp, Colonel Alexander Hamilton. The future Secretary of the Treasury was already demonstrating the intellectual brilliance that would later reshape American finance. But on this night, he was simply a 20-year-old artillery officer preparing for battle. Alexander, Washington, said quietly, "If we fail tomorrow, ensure that word reaches Congress of our intentions. Let them know we died fighting for liberty, not cowering behind creek banks." Hamilton nodded solemnly, understanding that he was witnessing a moment that would define not just their army's fate, but the destiny of the American experiment in self-governance. At precisely 1 o'clock on the morning of January 3rd, 1777, the Continental Army began what would become one of the most daring maneuvers in military history. Washington himself led the column, his familiar figure wrapped in a dark cloak as he guided his horse through the frozen darkness. Behind him stretched a line of 3,000 men, moving with ghostly silence along the back roads of New Jersey, their footsteps muffled by fresh snow that had begun falling as if to mask their desperate gambit. The march route took the army along Sandtown Road and Quaker Bridge Road, skirting wide around the British positions near Trenton. Captain Stephen Olney of the Rhode Island Regiment later described the surreal quality of that night movement, men stumbling through darkness, so complete that soldiers could barely see the man ahead of them, guided only by whispered commands and the occasional glint of starlight on metal. The artillery wheels creaked ominously as they rolled over frozen ruts, each sound seeming to echo like thunder in the still air. General Hugh Mercer's advance guard moved with particular caution, knowing that discovery by British patrols would doom the entire enterprise. The Virginia general had served with distinction in the French and Indian War, and his experience in wilderness warfare proved invaluable. As he led his men through unfamiliar terrain in absolute darkness, behind him, the main column stretched for nearly 2 miles, a serpentine line of desperate men carrying the hopes of a nascent nation on their shoulders. The weather gods seemed to favor the American cause that night, as a thick fog began to roll in from the Delaware, providing additional concealment for the marching army. Yet the same conditions that hid their movement also made navigation treacherous. More than once, the column had to halt while scouts verified their position. Precious minutes ticking away as dawn approached, and with it the likelihood of discovery. Colonel John Fitzgerald, one of Washington's Irish-born aides-de-camp, rode alongside his commander throughout the grueling march. Years later, Fitzgerald would recount how Washington maintained absolute composure despite the enormous pressure, stopping periodically to encourage stragglers and ensure that no man was left behind. The general's presence seemed to infuse the entire column with determination, transforming what might have been a panicked retreat into a purposeful advance toward destiny. As the first pale hints of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, the Continental Army approached the outskirts of Princeton. The college town was held by a British garrison under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, consisting of the 17th Foot, 55th Foot, and a detachment of cavalry. These troops were among Britain's finest, veterans of European campaigns, who had never imagined they would face serious opposition from colonial rebels. In the wilderness of New Jersey, Washington deployed his forces with the skill of a master tactician. Despite the exhaustion that weighed on every man after their night-long march, he positioned Sullivan's division to attack Princeton from the south, while Greene's troops would approach from the southwest. The artillery under Hamilton and Forrest took position to provide supporting fire, their cannons loaded and ready to speak with voices of bronze and iron. The plan required precise timing and coordination between multiple columns moving through unfamiliar terrain in the growing light of dawn. One mistake, one unit moving too early or too late, could result in disaster for the entire army. As Washington surveyed the sleeping town of Princeton through the morning mist, he knew that the next hour would determine whether American independence would survive or perish. In the fields of New Jersey, the general drew his sword, its blade catching the first rays of sunlight, and prepared to give the order that would launch his army into one of the most decisive battles of the Revolutionary War. The morning of January 3rd, 1777, dawned clear and cold over Princeton as Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood prepared his British garrison for what he assumed would be another routine day of winter quarters. The veteran officer had no knowledge of Washington's desperate gambit, believing like his superior Cornwallis that the rebel army remained Trapped at Trenton. As Mahud reviewed his morning reports, the sound of musket fire erupted from the southern approaches to town, shattering the peaceful morning and announcing that war had come to Princeton. General Hugh Mercer's advance guard had encountered a British foraging party near the William Clark Farm, just south of Princeton. The Virginians deployed rapidly, their long rifles speaking with deadly accuracy as they engaged the surprised enemy troops. But Mahud was no ordinary garrison commander. He was a seasoned professional who reacted with lightning speed to the unexpected threat. Within minutes, he had the 17th Foot formed into battle line, their disciplined ranks advancing with bayonets fixed toward the sound of gunfire. The battle that followed would test the mettle of both armies in ways neither had anticipated. Mercer's men, exhausted from their night-long march, found themselves facing British regulars fighting on familiar ground. With the advantage of interior lines, the clash near Clark's Orchard became a swirling melee of musket fire and bayonet charges, smoke from hundreds of weapons creating a fog of war that obscured friend from foe. Captain John Fleming of the Virginia Regiment later wrote in his journal that the fighting reached an intensity unlike anything he had experienced in 3 years of war. British infantry advanced in perfect formation, their brown bess muskets delivering coordinated volleys that cut down American soldiers with mechanical precision. Yet the Continentals held their ground with desperate courage, knowing that retreat meant the destruction of their cause and likely their own deaths at the end of British bayonets. The tide of battle turned decisively when Washington himself appeared on the field, his white horse conspicuous among the smoke and chaos of combat. According to eyewitness accounts preserved in the New Jersey Historical Society archives, the general rode directly toward the British lines, seemingly oblivious to the musket balls whistling around him. His presence electrified the American troops, transforming a confused skirmish into a coordinated assault that broke the back of British resistance. General Mercer fell mortally wounded during the fierce fighting, struck down by British bayonets. As he attempted to rally his men, the loss of the beloved Virginia general might have demoralized the American forces, but Washington's personal leadership prevented panic from spreading through the ranks. The commander-in-chief's calm courage under fire became legendary among his soldiers, many of whom later claimed they had witnessed Providence itself protecting their general from enemy bullets. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery played a crucial role in the battle's climax, unlimbering their guns within close range of the British positions and pouring devastating fire into the enemy ranks. The young artillery officer's mathematical precision in laying his cannons proved decisive. As canister shots swept away British resistance like a scythe through wheat, Hamilton's guns, supported by Captain Thomas Forrest's battery, created gaps in the enemy line that American infantry exploited with bayonet charges of their own. The British resistance collapsed with stunning suddenness. Mahud's disciplined troops, who had fought with professional courage against overwhelming odds, finally broke and fled toward the relative safety of Princeton itself. American soldiers, many of whom had contemplated desertion just days earlier, now pursued their enemies with jubilant shouts that echoed across the frozen fields. The impossible had happened again. Washington's Continental Army had defeated British regulars in open battle. As smoke cleared from the battlefield, revealing the full extent of their victory, Washington's soldiers began to understand that they had participated in something extraordinary. The twin victories at Trenton and Princeton had transformed the character of the war, proving that American soldiers could defeat the finest troops Europe could produce. The streets of Princeton echoed with the sound of American soldiers as Washington's army occupied the college town in the aftermath of their stunning victory. Nassau Hall, the impressive stone building that served as the heart of the College of New Jersey, had briefly sheltered fleeing British troops before they surrendered to the advancing Continentals. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery had put a cannonball through the building's wall, creating a breach that symbolized the shattering of British invincibility. In the minds of both armies, Washington moved quickly to consolidate his victory, knowing that Cornwallis would soon discover the escape from Trenton and march north with his superior force. The general established his headquarters in the college president's house, while his soldiers systematically gathered the spoils of war. The British garrison had abandoned substantial quantities of supplies, including much-needed blankets, food, and ammunition, for an army that had been on the verge of dissolution just days earlier. These captured stores represented the difference between survival and defeat. The human cost of the Princeton victory became clear as American soldiers tended to their wounded and counted their dead. General Hugh Mercer lay dying from multiple bayonet wounds, surrounded by his devoted Virginia soldiers, who knew they were losing one of the Revolution's finest officers. Captain John McPherson and Lieutenant Bartholomew Yates had also fallen in the fierce fighting, their sacrifice joining the growing roll of honor that marked America's struggle for independence. Yet the psychological impact of the victory far outweighed the material gains. Word of Washington's triumph spread through the colonies like wildfire, carried by express riders who galloped along muddy roads to bring news that the cause of liberty still lived. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress who had been preparing to flee westward suddenly found their confidence restored. The victories at Trenton and Princeton proved that American soldiers could defeat British regulars when properly led and motivated. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who had witnessed the desperate council of war just hours earlier, marveled at the transformation in both army and cause. Writing to his wife from Princeton, Rush observed that the genius of liberty has breathed new life into our soldiers, and they now march with the confidence of men who know they fight for something greater than themselves. The physician's words captured the mood of an army that had rediscovered its purpose, and Pride. International observers began to take notice of the remarkable resurrection of the American cause. French agents, who had been skeptical of colonial military capabilities, now reported to Versailles that Washington's army might actually be capable of sustaining a long war against British power. These assessments would prove crucial in the coming months as America sought foreign allies to support their struggle for independence. Washington himself seemed transformed by the experience of leading his army through its darkest hour to unexpected triumph. The Virginia planter, who had assumed command of a disintegrating force in December, now stood as the architect of one of military history's most remarkable comebacks. His soldiers looked at him with something approaching reverence, understanding that they had witnessed leadership of the highest order under the most desperate circumstances. As reports reached British headquarters in New York, the shock waves of Princeton rippled through the enemy command structure. General William Howe, comfortable in his Manhattan winter quarters, suddenly faced the reality that his strategy of crushing the rebellion through overwhelming force had failed. The ragged Continental Army that should have dissolved in the face of British might had instead struck back with devastating effectiveness. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. Washington had demonstrated that the Continental Army could not only survive British offensives, but could seize the initiative and strike at times and places of its own choosing. The Revolution had found its military legs, and the long struggle for American independence had truly begun. As January 3rd, 1777, drew to a close, General George Washington faced a crucial decision that would define the character of his emerging victory. Lord Cornwallis was already marching north from Trenton with 8,000 troops, determined to trap and destroy the Continental Army at Princeton. Washington's exhausted soldiers had been marching and fighting for nearly 24 hours straight. Yet the general knew that remaining in Princeton would invite annihilation by superior British forces converging on the town. The decision to withdraw to winter quarters in Morristown represented strategic brilliance disguised as prudent retreat. Washington understood that his twin victories at Trenton and Princeton had achieved something far more valuable than captured ground or enemy casualties. They had restored American morale and proved that British forces were not invincible. The general ordered his army to collect their wounded, gather their prisoners, and prepare for another difficult march through the frozen New Jersey countryside. The withdrawal from Princeton became a masterpiece of military movement as Washington's force melted away from the town just as Cornwallis's advance guard appeared on the southern horizon. The British general arrived to find empty buildings and cold campfires, his quarry having vanished once again into the winter landscape for the second time in 3 days. Washington had outmaneuvered one of Britain's most experienced commanders, demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that would eventually win American independence. The impact of the Princeton victory resonated far beyond the immediate battlefield. Throughout the colonies, militia units that had been on the verge of disbanding suddenly found new recruits, eager to serve under Washington's banner. The general's reputation as a military genius spread through taverns and town meetings, creating a legend that would sustain American resistance through the darkest days of the war. Men who had considered the cause hopeless now spoke of ultimate victory with genuine conviction. According to contemporary accounts published in the Pennsylvania Chronicle, the news of Princeton reached European capitals within weeks, fundamentally altering international perceptions of the American rebellion. French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes, who had been skeptical of colonial military capabilities, now began serious discussions about potential alliance with the fledgling United States. The victories demonstrated that America possessed both the will and ability to sustain a prolonged war against British power. The British response to Princeton revealed the extent to which Washington's victories had disrupted enemy strategy. General Howe abandoned his plan to crush the rebellion through a single decisive campaign, instead adopting a more cautious approach that sought to control key population centers, while avoiding the kind of surprise attacks that had made Trenton and Princeton possible. This strategic shift gave the Continental Army precious time to rebuild and prepare for the longer struggle ahead. For the soldiers who had participated in the Princeton campaign, the experience became a source of pride that sustained them through subsequent hardships. Veterans of the battle would gather for decades afterward to share memories of that frozen morning, when they had helped change the course of history. Captain Thomas Rodney spoke for many when he wrote that we learned at Princeton that Americans could fight and win, and that knowledge made all the difference in the world. The college town itself bore permanent scars from the battle, with Nassau Hall's damaged walls serving as a reminder of the day when war came to Princeton. Yet, the community took pride in its role in American independence, understanding that their town had witnessed one of the Revolution's most crucial moments. The College of New Jersey would eventually become Princeton University, its campus forever linked to the birth of American liberty. Washington established winter quarters in Morristown. With an army transformed by victory, the demoralized rabble that had contemplated dissolution in December had become a confident force that believed in its cause and its commander. The general himself had evolved into a national figure whose name symbolized American resistance to tyranny. The battles of Trenton and Princeton had created the legend of George Washington, laying the foundation for his eventual role as the father of his country. As spring approached and both armies prepared for renewed campaigning, the strategic landscape had fundamentally changed. Britain could no longer assume that superior numbers and training would guarantee victory over American forces. The Revolution had survived its greatest crisis and emerged stronger, setting the stage for the long struggle that would eventually culminate in American independence at Yorktown 4 years later.